and sitting before the flickering flames of the fire, I will tell you a story from these ancient times. On the one hand, the Roman Empire, at the height of its power, ruling over the four corners of the world. On the other, the Germanic tribes living in the shadows of forests, swamps, and mountains, a brave and warlike people who clung to their freedom. Are you ready to hear the story of the days when two different worlds collided and changed the course of history? This story begins on the borders of Rome's vast territory, a land inhabited by Germanic tribes. With a power that wanted to control everything, the Romans had subjugated many nations across their vast territory stretching from west to east. But the Germanic lands stood as an obstacle to Rome's ambition. No matter how powerful they were, these people were too independent, too proud, and too free to ever submit. So this is where Rome's first foray into the Germanic tribes, on whose borders it had come to rely, began. Over time, tensions grew between them, because Rome's expanding borders also coveted the free lands of the Germanic people. It was at this point that one of the greatest conflicts in history was about to ignite. The Germanic tribes were preparing to defend their land, their culture, and their freedom, while Rome advanced with its powerful army and sought to control them. This was not just a war, but the confrontation of two different cultures, two different ways of life. So on the one hand, the Romans who believed in the power of cities, roads, and rules. On the other hand, the Germanic tribes who lived as a part of nature, who did not know what borders meant, who valued freedom and loyalty above all else. Now it's time to delve deeper into this story and listen to this epic saga of Roman legions versus Germanic warriors, where pride and faith, betrayal and triumph are intertwined. Let's dive deeper and see in full detail those unforgettable moments when two worlds collided. As the hot flames of the fire flicker, visualize the vast territory of Rome. The Roman Empire was the most glorious power of its time, its armies terrorizing the world, news of victory echoing through the streets of Rome. Rome stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the cold lands of Britain and eastward to the rich lands of Anatolia. But when they turned their eyes north into the deep forests of what is now Germany, they found a completely different people, Germanic tribes. In Rome's eyes, the Teutons were barbarians, or rough, disorderly, and savage people, ignorant of the blessings of civilization. In the eyes of the Romans, civilization was cities connected by roads with rules and laws. The Teutons, however, lived a life free from these rules, completely immersed in nature. For them, freedom was the greatest and indispensable value. Neither money nor land could be a reward for them to kneel down as Rome wanted. The Romans wanted to control these people, bring them their civilization, and secure the borders of the empire. Every Roman who set foot on Germanic soil represented a confrontation between civilization and freedom. In those first contacts, when the Romans entered the lands of the Germanic tribes, they encountered a completely different world dominated by nature. High forests, deep rivers, and warrior tribes hiding themselves in this vast geography. Although the Romans had disciplined and well-equipped armies, these harsh natural conditions and the guerrilla warfare strategies of the Teutons baffled them. The Teutons fought with determination to protect their land. It was their identity and their philosophy of life. And of course, these first encounters were also the first signs of what was to come for Rome. At first glance, the Romans may have thought they could easily subdue these tribes. But the deeper they dug, the more they began to realize just how strong and fearless these people were in their own land. Because the Teutons lived their lives on this land, every tree, every river was their protector. Their devotion to themselves and their way of life was a much greater force than the Romans had imagined. It was in those first contacts that the story of a people dedicated to nature and freedom against the unlimited power of the Roman Empire began to blossom. This chain of events was preparing both Rome and the Germanic tribes for one of the most difficult tests in history. Now we will get to know these two worlds better and witness the brutal battle between them. This land, close your eyes and listen to the silence, in a land where cold winds sweep across the steppes, fir and oak forests rise to the sky, and rivers tangle together. So this is the home of the Germanic tribes, from the icy lands of Scandinavia to the lush forests of Central Europe. This vast geography with its soil, stones, and waters gave them shelter and shaped their character. So this wild nature not only strengthened them, but also shaped their outlook on life, war, and nature. The Germanic tribes grew up as children of this harsh and difficult geography. They lived in harmony with the rhythm of nature, hunting, fighting, and struggling for survival. While the depths of the forest waited silently under the white blanket of winter, they formed alliances, built their villages, and made respect for nature an integral part of their daily lives. Every tree, every river, every mountain was sacred to them because this land was filled with the spirits of their ancestors. That is why there was a story hidden under every stone, a secret behind every mountain. This richness of culture, which varied from tribe to tribe, gave them a unique identity. For example, the tribes living in the north of Scandinavia made friends with the cold and became famous for their endurance. Scandinavian tribes learned how to paddle fish in frozen seas, navigate their way through snowstorms, and pass on their fighting spirit by telling stories to each other in the dark winter nights. Their gods were just like them, strong, fierce, and loyal. These gods spoke to the people, gave strength to the warriors, and guided them on the battlefield. So every time they went to battle, they fought not only with devotion to the enemy, but also to their gods. When we look at the woodland tribes of Central Europe, we see a completely different world. These tribes lived in the heart of the forests, in the shade of huge trees, making their own rules and living their lives with their own belief systems. These vast forests were both their home and their sacred sanctuary. For them, nature was not only a shelter, but also a sacred door through which they communicated with their gods. They believed that every tree had a soul, and they hunted every animal with respect, because no matter how harsh and cruel nature treated them, it was a part of their lives. Their warrior spirit was also imbued with this nature. With their shields made of trees, their powerful arrows and stone axes, they were silent hunters who could emerge from the forest out of nowhere and stun their enemies. The strong bond that held them all together was the love of freedom. In spite of the order, rules, and discipline of Rome, each Germanic warrior was brave enough to defend his freedom to the last drop of blood. Because for these tribes, freedom was not just a right, it was the meaning of their whole life. That is why in the days when they would face the armies of Rome, they were ready to make any sacrifice to protect their land. The lifestyle and culture of the Germanic tribes made them a unique community to face the Romans. These people, born and raised in that nature, were ready to irrigate the land with their blood, ready to face the danger that was coming. And now we will see how these tribes will preserve their identity and stand against the Roman order. Those borders, Rome's ambitiously expanding borders, and the Germanic tribes' love of freedom were sparking an ever greater conflict. At the height of its power, Rome coveted these vast lands. Its goal was to incorporate these people, whom it called barbarians, into its borders, take control of their trade routes and lands, and make them Roman citizens. However, for the Germanic tribes, freedom was above all else, and this desire of the Romans stood as a great threat in their eyes. At first there were small-scale trade agreements. The Germanic tribes entered into this trade, eager to obtain Rome's luxury goods, and offer the Romans the furs they hunted and the valuable resources from their lands. But these relations were always unbalanced, a power struggle. Against the mighty armies and authority of Rome, the Germanic tribes were challenged by their own independent spirit and way of life in harmony with nature. But as the Romans sought to incorporate these tribes into their system, beyond trade agreements, conflict became inevitable. Land disputes played an important role in the collision of these two worlds. The Teutons believed that every inch of land belonged to them, to their ancestors. Forests, rivers, and vast steppes were not only natural resources for them, but also sacred places. Rome, on the other hand, coveted these fertile lands and tried to gain more control over them by strengthening its military outposts along the border. Each new outpost meant a great insult, a challenge to the Teutons. These invasive steppes of Rome tried the patience of the Germanic tribes, and each new outpost fueled the fire of rebellion. One of the most obvious reasons for these tensions was Rome's ever-increasing striving for control. While Rome saw itself as the owner of the entire world and believed it had the right to rule other nations, the Germanic tribes were unwilling to submit to this imposition. Roman efforts to impose rules and taxes on the tribes clashed with the Germanic spirit of independence, pulling both sides into a maelstrom. It was no longer just a question of borders, it was a battle to prove who they were. In every conflict, in every disagreement, Rome was trying to intimidate these tribes it considered barbaric, while the Teutons felt one step closer to freedom with every victory. Two different worlds were approaching each other step by step on the same border and heading towards the great conflict. The Germanic tribes were determined to defend their lands, Rome thought itself invincible. The storm that would arise from the clash of these two stubborn souls would exact a price on both sides. Arminius. That famous leader of the Germanic tribes, the hero who stabbed Rome in the chest like a dagger. A warrior who grew up on Roman soil, learned the martial discipline of the Roman army, but always carried in his heart the freedom of his own people. His story was a betrayal in the arrogant eyes of the Romans, but a saga of great resistance for his own people. Arminius' life was like watching the birth of a storm. His youth in the ranks of Rome was in fact the leaven of that storm. Arminius' days as a soldier in Rome may have seemed like the rise of an ordinary soldier, but in reality they were preparations for a growing rebellion. The invincibility of the Roman Empire was a truth universally acknowledged at the time. Wherever the armies of Emperor Augustus set foot, they conquered and controlled everything. But Arminius not only learned about Rome's strength, he also discovered its weaknesses. Rome's military organization, its discipline, its tactics, all this was taught to him. But what the Romans didn't realize was that they were training one of their own and preparing their own doom. Young Arminius went on many campaigns as part of the Roman army, marching alongside Roman generals. But he was always a stranger. His blood was Germanic and his soul was full of rebellion. As he watched Rome's victories, he saw the captivity of his own people, the Germanic tribes. The Teutons were a disorganized and unruly people against Rome. It seemed impossible to bring them together, to unite them into a single force. But this is where Arminius' real genius came in. As he learned the troop tactics and discipline used by Rome, he dreamed of turning this knowledge into a weapon for his own people. Arminius joined Rome not only as a soldier but also as a student. He fought in their army and learned how to stand up to them. In the process, he saw the great difference between Rome and his own people. Rome's armies were organized, trained, and disciplined. The Teutons were like a wild jungle, disorganized but strong in their own nature. What Arminius had to do was to combine this nature of the Germanic tribes with the discipline and tactics of Rome. What seemed impossible to many became a goal in Arminius' mind. He would be the leader who would free his people from the Roman yoke. The process of uniting the Germanic tribes was fraught with difficulties. The Teutons were free-spirited, each tribe jealously guarded its independence. But Arminius had the power to bring them together. Anger against Rome was the only thing that could unite these tribes. Arminius was able to convince the tribal leaders of the arrogant behavior of the Romans, their attempts to seize their lands and their oppression of the Germanic people. Rome's arrogance and greed was the biggest motivator for the Germanic tribes. And when that day came, these tribes, united by Arminius' intelligence, would no longer be a threat to Rome, but a nightmare. Deep in the Germanic forests, Arminius would wage a war against one of Rome's greatest armies. It was the great Battle of Teutoburg Forest, which resulted in the destruction of Varus' army. But this victory was not only a military success, it also symbolized the liberation of the Germanic people from the Roman yoke. Everything Arminius had learned in Rome over the years came together for this moment. But the story doesn't end there, of course. Arminius' victory was only the beginning. After this great victory, the Roman Empire would never again approach Germanic lands in the same way. Arminius would be remembered as a hero to his own people and a traitor to Rome. But it also showed that victory did not come without a price. Arminius' efforts to unite the Germanic tribes and his victory over Rome would also turn into a personal tragedy. Power struggles, leadership disputes, and betrayals among the Teutons would overshadow Arminius' life. His victory over Rome did not bring him personal peace. But history would always remember him as the architect of Rome's greatest defeat. And so Arminius' story ended with a lesson that Rome would never forget. The unforgettable Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Rome's supposedly invincible armies were crushed by Arminius' clever ambush. Rome, which had once trusted Arminius, had no idea that he would become its greatest enemy. More than just a battle, it was the ultimate proof of how the Roman Empire's power was weakening, blinded by their own arrogance. Once Arminius had united the Germanic tribes, he was able to unite them into a single fist against Rome. But the secret was not just in uniting the tribes. Arminius had also thought long and hard about how to defeat the Roman army. Because the Roman army was a force like no other in the world, not only in numbers but also in tactics and discipline. However, Arminius' real strength was that the Romans underestimated him. The Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus failed to recognize Arminius' plan. He trusted him because Arminius was a soldier trained by Rome. It was this trust that sealed Rome's doom. The Teutoburg forest would decide the fate of the war. That forest, silent, deep, frightening. As the Roman soldiers marched deeper into that dark forest, they had no idea that they were walking into a trap skillfully set by Arminius' genius. This ambush would prove disastrous for Rome. Arminius led the Roman army down muddy and narrow forest roads. As Rome's great legions marched along these narrow and winding paths, their greatest advantage order began to break down. The Roman army was used to fighting on flat, wide-open spaces. But here, in the middle of this wild jungle, their formations were disorganized, commanders had difficulty communicating orders, and coordination between soldiers was completely lost. This is exactly what Arminius wanted. Rome's army was great, but it was at this point that the giant began to weaken. The Romans were like a giant lost in the Germanic lands. And then the moment came. Arminius and his tribal warriors emerged from the shadows of the forest and descended on the Romans like lightning. Swords, spears, and arrows. The Roman soldiers were stunned. The Germanic warriors fought with the fury of a people who had been under the yoke of Rome for years. Arminius had surrounded the Roman army, encircling them with nowhere to run. Varus' soldiers, however well trained, were defenseless in this wilderness, in this skillful ambush. Many were lost in the dark forest, others were killed before they could defend themselves. Before Varus' eyes, his army melted away one by one, slipping away like grains of sand. This was not just a battle, it was the beginning of a catastrophe for Rome. 3 Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were completely wiped out. Such a defeat was rare in Roman history. When Varus realized that his army was completely destroyed, he found the situation irreparable and chose to take his own life. Rome's invincible legions had vanished into the depths of that forest for nothing. After this blow, the Roman Empire would never again forget the Teutoburg forest and those lost legions. But you see, this victory was not just about the Germanic tribes defeating the Romans. It was the moment when the arrogance of the Roman Empire was shattered. Rome, though it ruled vast territories, was helpless in the face of Arminius' genius. This defeat halted Rome's advance into Germanic lands. After this disaster, Emperor Augustus never again tried to organize a major campaign against the Germanic lands. This defeat clarified Rome's borders. The Germanic lands were never fully under Roman rule. Arminius' genius combined with Rome's arrogance, and the result was an unforgettable lesson for the Roman Empire. The Teutoburg forest was not just a battlefield, it symbolized the weakness of Rome and the heroic epic that Arminius etched into history. The Roman Empire mourned the loss of these 3 legions for years. As Emperor Augustus cried out, "Varus, give me back my legions," Rome's belief in invincibility was shattered. With this victory, the Teutons gained self-confidence against Rome, and with it a place in history that will never be forgotten. Arminius' name was engraved in eternity with the greatest victory against Rome. Ah, Rome! After their great defeat in the Teutoburg forest, their anger never subsided. Emperor Augustus was shaken by the destruction of Varus' armies. Confidence in the strength of the Roman Empire was shaken, but Rome would never accept defeat. After the brutal jungle in which their arrogance was shattered, Rome was burning for revenge. For Rome, this defeat was not just a loss of battle, but a blow to the prestige and honor of the entire empire. Revenge, therefore, would be Rome's resurrection. A few years later, Rome's quest for revenge finally materialized. This time, Rome was not taking any chances. It would take a great leader to avenge the 3 legions lost at Teutoburg, and that leader was Gaius Germanicus. Germanicus was the nephew of Tiberius, Augustus' heir, and had a reputation as one of Rome's most talented generals. His victories for Rome at a young age had earned him respect and prestige. Now the next great task for Germanicus was clear: to defeat Arminius, bring the Germanic tribes to their knees and restore Rome's honor. Germanicus first prepared a detailed plan. For Arminius was no ordinary barbarian leader facing Rome. He was a genius who knew Roman military tactics and skillfully used this knowledge to the advantage of his own tribes. This time, Germanicus would reverse Arminius' plans and avoid repeating the mistakes of the Romans. Moreover, Germanicus did not see the war simply as a military victory. This campaign would restore Rome's lost honor and show the empire's power to the world once again. Germanicus' campaign began with a deep penetration into Germanic lands. He gathered the Roman armies in massive force, but this time he was careful. He organized his legions according to the challenging geography of Germania. He would not allow the dark mistake of the Teutoburg forest to happen again. His strategy was to defeat Arminius on his own soil and at his own game. As a first step, Germanicus launched a diplomatic campaign to win back Roman allies in Germania. After Teutoburg, many tribes had turned their backs on Rome. Arminius's victory had created great confidence among the Germanic tribes, but Germanicus managed to win over some Germanic leaders to his side. Diplomacy and military power combined. Meanwhile, Germanicus was preparing a grand strategy against Arminius. The first goal was to save Rome's former allies and weaken the unity among the Germanic tribes. Arminius was a legendary leader in the Germanic lands, but tribal loyalty was not always enduring. Germanicus used this weakness to gain the support of some tribes and succeeded in splitting Arminius' united forces. But Germanicus knew that the Teutons were fierce warriors, and he understood that it would not be easy to draw them into direct conflict with Rome's heavily armored legions. That's why he was careful as he marched step by step into Germanic territory, taking strategic precautions such as avoiding wooded areas and keeping the legions in the open. Arminius, on the other hand, was closely following Germanicus' advance. Hearing that Rome was back in his territory, Arminius had to be more cautious this time. His plan was not to lure Germanicus into the same trap, but to engage him in a long process of war attrition. While the Germanic tribes were wearing down the Roman army with scattered battles, Arminius was planning a major offensive. This time, however, luck was not on his side. Germanicus' army was more disciplined and better prepared. Germanicus had also learned from the mistakes of Teutoburg. One by one, Arminius' traps were sprung. With each step, Germanicus moved deeper into Germanic territory, consolidating his power with small victories against Arminius' armies. When Germanicus finally reached Arminius' territory, a major battle was inevitable. On the plains of Germania, Roman legions and Germanic warriors faced each other. These battles proved difficult for Arminius. The disorganized fighting formations of the Germanic tribes were no match for the disciplined and heavily armored soldiers of the Roman legions. Germanicus not only defeated Arminius' armies but forced him to retreat. But Arminius was not captured. Each time he retreated deeper into the forests, waiting for an opportunity to prepare the next attack. Towards the end of the campaign, Germanicus achieved significant victories in Germanic territories. He defeated Arminius and reconnected some of the German tribes to Rome. However, the fact that Arminius wasn't completely wiped out prevented these victories from having a decisive outcome. Germanicus's return to Rome was a huge morale booster for the empire, but the complete conquest of Germania still hadn't happened. Arminius continued to exist as a national hero, and no matter how great Germanicus's victories were, for the Germans, this war was never truly over. In the end, Germanicus achieved major successes in seeking revenge for Rome. The honor Rome had lost was being regained. However, Arminius's resistance indicated that the struggle of the German tribes for freedom would last forever. Arminius and his Germanic tribes. After defeating Rome in the Teutoburg Forest, Arminius became a legend. Under his leadership, the victory against Rome made a huge impact in the Germanic world. All the tribes admired Arminius' genius and saw him as a savior. Rome, thought to be invincible with its powerful legions, suffered a heavy defeat on German soil. The thrill of victory coursed through all the barbarian tribes. These fragmented, independent tribes, each prioritizing their own interests, had momentarily come together. But like everything else, the high of victory was fleeting. Dark clouds were gathering over this unity. Following this victory, Arminius became not just a leader but a symbol of freedom and independence against Rome. However, we must remember that Arminius' success stemmed not only from his military genius, but also from the shared feeling of enmity against Rome. Yet, after that great victory, the common bond started to fade. While Rome was now behind them, new rivalries were sprouting among the tribes. The internal conflicts and disagreements that always existed among the tribes began to resurface. History has shown us that maintaining unity after victory is much harder than winning the war itself. As Arminius had to stay alert against Rome's new attacks, he was also dealing with growing unrest among his own people. As the threat from Rome diminished, tribal leaders began to challenge Arminius' authority. Each of these leaders was focused on their own tribe's interests. Issues like land distribution, power balance, and spoils of war became problems. It was not easy for Arminius to hold together such a diverse and independent structure. The victory had only secured a brief peace among the tribes. But there's a bloody truth in the history of the Germanic tribes. Each tribe fights for its own interests, and peace is against their nature. Especially old Roman allies like Segestes began to feel uneasy about Arminius' success, even though they had freed themselves from Roman control. This victory meant defeat for leaders like Segestes. Used to Rome's friendship, these leaders found themselves losing their authority and unsure of where the new order was headed with Arminius' rise. Segestes never truly embraced Arminius' victory. In his desire to maintain relations with Rome, he secretly started plotting against Arminius. The conflict between these two powerful leaders became a symbol of the unraveling among the tribes. The unraveling that came right after the victory was not just about personal interests. The Germanic tribes had been fighting each other for centuries, accumulating blood feuds. Though they had temporarily united against a common enemy, those old grudges still lingered deep down. The euphoria from the victory at Teutoburg Forest couldn't cover up those ancient hatreds. Arminius began to feel increasingly isolated among the tribes. The internal conflicts caused the unity gained against Rome to quickly dissolve. During this time, questions arose about Arminius' power. The great admiration felt for him immediately after the victory turned into doubts and even hostilities. Many tribes began to see Arminius as a threat after the victory. Each tribe's obsession with its own freedom made it difficult for Arminius to stand out as a singular leader. Even those who saw him as a hero were uncomfortable with one man having such influence over the tribes, as it went against Germanic traditions. Arminius' victory had united the tribes against Rome, but now, in the aftermath of that victory, the fragility of that unity was becoming clear. Old rivalries and personal interests among the tribes began to pose a greater threat to Arminius. While he fought against Rome, he couldn't manage to keep the victory intact among his own people. Over time, the memory of the great victory against Rome began to fade, replaced by the chaos created by conflicts among the tribes. In the end, Arminius found himself alone. This great leader, known for his victory against Rome, was betrayed by his own people. Leaders like Segestus took action to overthrow Arminius. This fragmentation right after the victory revealed the true nature of the Germanic tribes once again. Arminius had shattered Rome's invincibility in the Teutoburg forest, but he couldn't stop the chaos within his own people. The conflicts among the tribes weakened his legend, and ultimately Arminius fell victim to his own people's schemes. So even a great victory in the Germanic world couldn't overcome the struggles and conflicts of interest within that world. Although the Germanic tribes united against Rome, their internal wars never truly ended. This turned into a story that began with the thrill of victory but ended in disappointment. Arminius's rise was as dramatic and tragic as his fall. Yes, the victory he achieved in the Teutoburg forest shook the power of Rome. But victory doesn't always bring stability. The Germanic tribes, who were never really close to each other, began to question one another after the big win in the Teutoburg forest. The enemy wasn't outside anymore, it was now within. And Arminius, once a hero among these people, was slowly becoming isolated. Arminius was the mastermind behind the victory over Rome, thanks to his intelligence and military skills. But winning in the complex internal structure of the Germanic tribes was a lot easier than maintaining unity in the long run. The tribes had such a deep passion for freedom that no tribal leader could establish absolute authority. Over time, Arminius's attempts to unify them began to be seen as a threat by other leaders. Many tribal leaders, including Segestus, were afraid of losing their positions under the shadow of Arminius's victory against Rome. These seeds of fear and doubt grew into hostility toward Arminius. The balance of power among the tribes was always delicate. Arminius was a man trained by the Romans, someone who understood Roman tactics. He had learned how they operated and identified their weaknesses. This knowledge gave him a huge advantage in achieving victory. But defeating Rome was one thing, winning the hearts of his own people was another. Perhaps his biggest mistake was seeing himself as superior to the other tribes. For leaders like Segestes, Arminius's rise was a threat not just to Rome, but also to their own authority. Once the excitement of victory wore off, these leaders started plotting against Arminius. Although Segestes was known for his loyalty to Rome, he was also pursuing the interests of his own tribe. In his eyes, Arminius was not just a hero but a rival as well. This tension ultimately led to Arminius's betrayal. Segestes didn't hide his hostility toward Arminius and worked to undermine him, even in light of the victory he had achieved against Rome. Once a great leader who stood against Rome, Arminius was now being abandoned by his own people. Internal conflicts, disputes between tribes, and jealousy isolated him. He slowly distanced himself from his allies and became more alone. The safety net around him turned into betrayal. The tribe's desire for independence wouldn't allow Arminius to remain a singular leader. In the end, the greatest enemy for the Germans wasn't Rome, it was the infighting among themselves. When the shadow of betrayal fell upon Arminius, the taste of victory turned bitter. Segestus's provocations accelerated his downfall. The chaos and power struggles among the tribes made Arminius more of a target for his own people than for Rome. Thus, Arminius became not only a leader of a tribal uprising, but also a leader betrayed by his own people in history. The victories that had made him a hero couldn't prevent the betrayal that followed. Just a few years after those unforgettable days of victory against the Romans, Arminius was killed by his own people. The leader who had shaken Rome was powerless amid tribal disputes. With Arminius's death, the dream of unity among the Germanic tribes shattered once again. The tribes that had stood together until then began to face the Roman threat again. Rome took advantage of this fragmentation, looking for opportunities to prevent the Germanic tribes from coming together. Thus, Arminius's great victory became nothing more than a memory for the Germanic tribes after his death. But friends, remember, even Arminius's death couldn't erase his legend. He was a hero who stood against Rome and brought the Roman armies to their knees in the Teutoburg forest. Yet the harshness of history is such that even the greatest heroes are sometimes sacrificed by their own people. The tragic story of the Germanic tribes is one of the unity they lost within themselves after their victory over Rome. Ah, my dear friends, once upon a time the world trembled under Rome's iron fist. That mighty Rome had expanded its borders and established dominance all around. But my children, behind the grandeur of those days lay a constant threat, one that kept them awake at night. Barbarian tribes from the cold, dark forests of the north, deep in Europe. The Germans, the Goths, the Franks. These tribes had become Rome's greatest fear. Rome exerted tremendous effort to keep these barbarians under control, but this war wasn't just about swords and shields. It was also a battle of strategy, engineering, and determination. And this war shaped the permanent defensive lines that Rome built along its borders. In the beginning, Rome underestimated these barbarians. They saw them as nothing more than wild, disorganized nomadic groups. However, as time went on, these tribes began to discover Rome's weak points. Ah, what a painful realization that was for Rome. The walls, fortresses, and rivers they had deemed impenetrable for centuries started to come under threat, one by one. Therefore, Rome decided to build permanent defensive lines in strategically important areas. Oh, my children, these lines showcased not only Rome's military strength but also its engineering genius. The most famous of these was the Limes Germanicus, a massive defensive line stretching like a boundary. This was a gigantic fortification protecting Rome's northern frontier. Ah, dear friends, just imagine towers, fortresses, and ditches stretching for hundreds of kilometers. With this line, Rome didn't just create a physical barrier, it sent a message to the barbarian tribes: this is the boundary of Rome. If you want to enter, you must first cross this line. However, these defenses didn't always succeed. Because the enemy they faced, my children, was not merely one that relied on brute force. The German tribes learned over time. They too learned to fight, strategize, and discover weaknesses. Yes, Rome's permanent defenses were successful many times, managing to keep the barbarian tribes out for a while. But one day those defenses would be breached. History teaches us that no defensive line can withstand forever. Rome took a breather for a time behind this barrier built against the barbarian tribes. But deep down, they knew that these tribes would eventually return, stronger and more determined than ever. My children, Rome's strategy wasn't just about building walls and fortresses. They resorted to other methods to keep the barbarian tribes in check: diplomacy and trade. Rome made agreements with the leaders of the barbarian tribes, granting them land and titles. By allowing them to settle along the borders of Rome, they thought of using them as a buffer zone. But my children, this was risky, because one day, when these tribes sensed Rome's weakness, they would use that land as a springboard. Ah, the clashes at these borders gradually became a part of Rome's defensive strategy. The small fortresses, garrisons, and towers along the border were under constant attack from the barbarians. Roman soldiers fought a battle for their very survival. On one side, there were the disciplined and trained Roman legions, and on the other, brave barbarian warriors fiercely defending their freedom. These encounters represented the clash of two different worlds, two different ways of life. Although Rome had military and technological superiority, it struggled against the stubbornness, courage, and thirst for freedom of the barbarians. And so, my children, these permanent defensive lines were both a hope and a test for Rome. On one hand, they tried to keep the barbarian tribes out, while on the other they were curious about what lay beyond those lines. Were these tribes merely a threat, or could they be an opportunity for Rome's future? That was Rome's greatest dilemma. An empire had to face not only the threats from the outside, but also the weaknesses within. But my children, while Rome built these defensive lines, something was changing in the north. The barbarians developed their own strategies against Rome's tactics. They united, grew stronger, and began to attack in a more organized manner. And so those defensive lines were eventually breached. No matter how hard Rome tried to stop those tribes at the borders, the course of history was unstoppable. The barbarians pressed against Rome's gates, and when this great empire heard the footsteps of the barbarians, it sensed that it was approaching the end of an era. Ah, my children, history always tells us the same thing: every empire eventually falls. No matter how strongly constructed, even Rome's permanent defenses would one day collapse. The barbarian tribes surged through those borders, marking the beginning of a long process that would lead to Rome's downfall. Yet this collapse also marked a new beginning, because these barbarian tribes would establish a new order in Europe. New kingdoms, new leaders, new wars. The world was beginning to change once again. And so, my children, the defensive lines of Rome became a symbol of an era. On one side, there was Rome's glory and engineering prowess, and on the other, the stubbornness and thirst for freedom of the barbarians. And these two powers fought a struggle that would be etched into the pages of history. Ah, my children, it's hard to grasp how time flies. The lasting defenses of Rome rose, wars were fought, and borders were protected. Yet history shows us that nothing is eternal. As Rome trembled like a great wall about to fall, the threat it faced was not just from outside enemies, but from a growing unrest within. The uprisings of the Germanic tribes seemed to pose only a threat to Rome at first, but behind these rebellions lay a legacy that would change the course of history. The effects of these uprisings reached far beyond their time, echoing for centuries to come. No matter how hard Rome tried to stop the barbarian tribes, it became increasingly difficult to prevent the destruction caused by revolts and raids. These tribes uncovered Rome's weaknesses, crossed its borders, and began to shake the empire. But their real impact wasn't just felt on the battlefield, it revealed itself within Rome's very structure and culture. The Germanic tribes didn't just erode Rome's military strength, they profoundly affected its social fabric. To resist these tribes, Rome had to gather more soldiers and allocate more resources. With each passing year, these rebellions weakened Rome even further. The Germanic tribes were no ordinary enemies. They were fiercely dedicated to their freedom. Their courage and resilience challenged the disciplined legions of Rome. During these uprisings, Rome's army was repeatedly caught off guard by these tribes, pushed back, and suffered heavy losses. These tribes not only learned how to fight, but also figured out Rome's strategies. Over time, this barbarian resistance spread beyond the borders, advancing toward the heart of the empire. The uprisings reached a point where Rome began to consider making peace with these tribes, thinking of integrating them into the empire rather than continuing to battle them. But my children, the legacy of these tribes was not limited to the fall of Rome. The Germanic tribes would later lay the foundation for kingdoms that shaped Europe's future for centuries to come. These rebels pushing against Rome's borders were actually heralds of a new order. The Goths, the Franks, the Lombards, all were barbarian tribes and leaders of the uprisings that shook Rome. Yet, as a result of these uprisings, these communities, once seen as barbaric, became the new rulers of Western Europe. New kingdoms emerged from the lands of ancient Rome, many of which blended Rome's legacy with their own cultures. At this point, my children, we can better understand the long-term effects of the Germanic tribes' uprisings. They weren't only remembered for their military victories against Rome, they left behind a cultural legacy as well. The way of life, beliefs, and traditions of these tribes continued to thrive in Europe long after Rome's fall. Especially in Scandinavia, the culture of these barbarian tribes took strong root. In the cold, harsh climate of the north, the warrior spirit and passion for freedom of the Germanic tribes transformed into the way of life for the Scandinavian peoples. This spirit, which prepared the ground for the rise of the Vikings, was part of the legacy left by the Germanic tribes. The Vikings. Ah, my children, the Vikings were like the descendants carrying the legacy of the Germanic tribes. The warrior spirit of the Germans continued with the Vikings' ventures into the seas. Just like their ancestors, the Vikings did not shy away from exploration and conquest. Under the harsh conditions of Scandinavia, these peoples learned to survive against both nature and their enemies. Thus, the legacy of the barbarian tribes continued to live on not just on the battlefield, but culturally and socially in Scandinavia. This legacy, carrying their language, traditions, and even beliefs into the present, echoes the revolts that brought down Rome's power. The impact of these revolts didn't stop at wars. These tribes developed their own systems of governance and social structures in Europe after the fall of Rome. Many practices based on Roman law continued in the new kingdoms established by the Germanic tribes. However, these governments differed from Rome's disciplined and centralized structure. They developed a more tribal, local, and community-oriented style of governance. The Germanic tribes never lost their commitment to freedom, and this passion for freedom became ingrained in the foundations of their newly established kingdoms. My children, these uprisings symbolize not just the fall of an empire, but the birth of a new world. The Germanic tribes' rebellion against Rome was an event that reshaped Europe's cultural, political, and social landscape. By blending Rome's legacy with their own cultures, these tribes built a new order for Europe. Even today, it is possible to see the traces of these tribes in many places across Europe. Their courage, passion for freedom, and warrior spirit resonate in the foundations of modern Europe. And so, my children, as Rome's vast empire began to collapse, the rise of the barbarian tribes commenced. These uprisings were not just wars or raids, they represented a great transformation that shaped Europe's new face. The legacy of the Germans continues to echo throughout history, and the revolts they initiated heralded the end of Rome and the first steps of Europe's new beginning. Ah, my children, we've come to the end of another story. Today we took a journey back to ancient times, to the borders of Rome and the rebellions of the Germanic tribes that challenged those borders. I shared the rise and fall of an empire, and how a new world emerged from its collapse. When I close my eyes, I feel like I'm living those times again. I can hear the war cries echoing behind Rome's fortresses, sense the Germanic tribes' passion for freedom, and smell the winds of change that swept in from the cold north. All of this is part of the vast story that history has presented to us. Rome was once the center of the world, but like every empire, it had an end. This end was not just the destruction brought on by wars and rebellions, but also the beginning that sowed the seeds of a new order. The uprising of the Germanic tribes marked the start of a legacy that stretched from Scandinavia to the heart of Europe. Once labeled as barbarians, these people became the new rulers of Europe. The Goths, Franks, Vikings. Their courage, stubborn spirit, and thirst for freedom triumphed over Rome's disciplined legions. But their victory was not just military, it was a cultural, social, and even spiritual triumph. As time flows on, the echoes of those days are still heard today. History not only brings us memories of the past, but also offers lessons for the future. Today, Europe's great civilizations carry the legacy of those barbarian tribes that once toppled Rome. The marks left by these tribes are deeply woven into the fabric of history. My children, as I recount these corners of history and tales of ancient times, I feel as if I'm right in the midst of those events each time. It's as if I've lived through those days and stood on those battlefields. That's what history does. It takes you far away into forgotten memories and allows you to relive those moments over and over. Sometimes it takes a piece of you, building a bridge between the past and the future. That's all I have to share today. But this isn't the end. History is an endless story, and we are just a part of that tale. Each event, each character, is a lesson that carries us into the future. And it's our duty to remember these lessons and learn from them. We'll meet again in the next story, gathering around the fire to journey into another corner of history. Until then, I wish you safe travels. Remember that every story lies beyond a beginning and an end, for history never stands still.